Have you ever wondered why alcohol is so embedded across cultures? Why is it humanity's favourite drug? Also, why do some people get drunk so easily and others don't? Why do some people get a huge reward from alcohol and others could take it or leave it? Well, in this conversation, my guest answers a lot of these questions. Dr. Charles Knowles is an esteemed professor at Queen Mary University London. He's also the Chief Academic Officer at Cleveland Clinic London. And his recent book, Why We Drink Too Much, is a fantastic exploration of humanity's relationship with alcohol. And it also touches on Charles's own personal story, which we get into in this conversation. Thanks so much for joining. And I really enjoyed the book. Will you just tell me a little bit about your backstory?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on your show, Donal. Yes, well, I guess starting at the beginning, from the drinking perspective, I started drinking, I first had a drink when I was 13 in Germany, and I very much liked it even at the age of 13. I was enthusiastic about it. Even back then, I started regularly drinking by the age of 17, and I guess it's fair to say that right from the very start, it was, amazing for me. I mean, I just really enjoyed drinking, and it took away a lot of the discomfort from my life and seemed to be a solution really for all of my problems. I was at boarding school at the time, and, I was a bit of a nerdy, not terribly popular, not very socially confident teenager, and alcohol changed all of that for me. So, not unsurprisingly, I took to doing it more regularly quite quickly.
That was very interesting for me because it almost struck me that alcohol, and I've heard this from other accounts as well, that alcohol can actually be an agent of personality change. So in your case, it might have made you less introverted and perhaps less anxious. So is that accurate to say that it can facilitate a change in personality, almost like, I guess, an SSRI can do? It can lower your neuroticism. Alcohol can increase your extroversion and maybe lower your neuroticism temporarily as well.
Yeah, I mean, that it's sort of true and it isn't. In the true definition of a personality, the part of what makes up the definition is that it's not very changeable. But on the other hand, the observed behaviour of an individual on the basis of their personality can be greatly changed. And that's a major theme of my book, because it was certainly true for me for decades. And in fact, when I stopped drinking, quite aside from finding sobriety, there is a more fundamental question than the why this happened to me, but the question of who you really are is a question that, if you've drunk like me for 30 years, it's not just the why me question, it's the who am I question. And that's something you don't really hear people talk about it very much or write about it, but actually it's completely true, because in a sense you become defined by what you're now not. You are no longer a drinking persona, and finding out who you are might require going back to the very start and asking whether that was the true version of yourself.
That's really interesting, because sometimes it seems that a former alcoholic must miss drinking, like an element of it, because it does enable that level of, I guess, being social, and maybe your whole social environment is built around that. So is that difficult to deal with in terms of change?
Well, I think when you stop drinking, you have to relearn. You have to learn to be a non-drinker, because you can't forget drinking. I mean, you can't dememorize it. It's like riding a bike. I mean, you don't forget how to ride a bike. You'll always know how to do it. So it's not like you can change that. But what you can change is learn new skills of how to be an adult as a sober person. And everyone has to do that. And I mean, that is part of the process. I mean, for my own part, I'm still not a terribly social individual. I don't particularly like large groups of people. Partly that's because of my hearing now, that I just can't hear a word anyone says in a pub. But also, I'm much more accepting of it now. I think that the difference is that when I was 17, that was a major problem for me. Comparing myself with my peers, I was insufficient in terms of social fitness and my abilities, particularly with the opposite sex, as well as, friends and things. And now, of course, that doesn't worry me. So in a sense, I have the acceptance around who I really am, and my personality and my characteristics, some of which, like my neuroticism and ADHD, may have been in my favour, at least in terms of some of my success at work and my compulsion to work and other aspects. You've got to look on the bright side at some of these things. But that's not easy when you're 17.
That's a very good point, and we'll definitely come back to that. Let's just talk about it. I guess we should discuss why alcohol is very much embedded across cultures and maybe why that is in terms of evolutionary history. So I didn't actually know this until I read, I think it might have been the first chapter of the book, where you talk about why these adaptations happened in evolution, because rotting fruit on the ground and we had to eat it and it was fermenting, and obviously this aided survival. So can we just talk a little bit about that? Like, why is there this ability to actually to ingest alcohol or take in alcohol in humans? And it's not just humans as well, I should say.
The facts on the subject are that we evolved to metabolize alcohol so that it wasn't toxic to us 10 million years ago. And that is in a period of history where we as pre-humans, as primates, diverted in the primate line, losing the orangutan in the process and going along the line of the chimpanzee and the gorilla to a group of primates that could consume rotting fruit on the forest floor without that being toxic. And people have studied that, and you can buy ancestral genetics and you can show that that's where we got the liver enzymes that we required to metabolize alcohol, or at least the genes that encoded those liver enzymes. And from then onwards, I mean, we've been deliberately manufacturing alcohol for 15,000 years that we know of, based on excavations in Israel of ancient civilizations. And I think, so what was clearly a nutritional necessity, I think can't be claimed to be a nutritional necessity in the modern day. But there are many arguments, of course, for why alcohol remains embedded and ingrained as our most enduring drug within society that we could discuss. And part of that is, go on, Daniel.
So just coming in that, is it that the fact that we're social primates, obviously we're heavily social and our entire lives are formed around these social structures, and the fact that it could be a social agent, is that part of it, why it became so embedded in culture, and I guess why it is such, like, actually fermenting alcohol is such an ancient practice, even beyond like evolutionary history?
Yeah, I think the answer to that in truth isn't known, but certainly the thesis I propose in my book, which I think is completely reasonable, is that the coincidence of the deliberate fermentation of alcohol with the first period in history where we lived in groups is not a coincidence. So about 15,000 years ago, or over a period between sort of 20 and 10,000, is when we first started living in groups of 100 or 150. It coincides with modern agricultural practice in terms of looking after sheep and growing crops. And that gave people free time to socialize, really, for the first time in groups. And one can suppose that that was actually quite difficult back then for some people, as it was for me in the modern day. And of course, back then you didn't have mobile phones or board games or anything else to lubricate social connection. So sitting round the campfire, that may well have been an enabler. And if you think about things that we do round the campfire, or they did round the campfire, like dancing and storytelling, which are formative activities, those are two things that are very clearly enabled by alcohol, even in the modern age. I mean, I'm a terrible dancer, even with or without alcohol, but certainly storytelling can improve with it.
Likewise, I'm not a good dancer either, with or without alcohol. So I was struck by this concept of a primary reward. So I think the analogy you gave was you can learn to enjoy your home team winning a game, or you can learn to enjoy the idea of winning the lottery. Like a baby doesn't know anything about the lottery, but alcohol is different to that. So it hits very deep in terms of primary neural architecture. It's a primary reward. So it exploits the same system that food or sexual reproduction would, deep in the brain, the ventral tegmental area, I think, and the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. So could you just talk about what we mean by a primary reward? And I guess that might explain to people why alcohol and other drugs can be so addictive.
I mean, I think you've explained it very well, Daniel, but I'll elaborate. So a primary reward is a reward that without any learning serves as a reward. So in any situation, whether you've never encountered it before, that would ultimately release dopamine in relevant areas of the brain to give a pleasant or rewarding experience. And drugs and alcohol are examples of that because they directly change neurotransmitters in certain parts of the brain, particularly the reward pathway, that are associated with hedonism, with feeling great, euphoria, relaxation, stimulation. And that contrasts with the secondary reward, which requires learning. So you have to, over a period of time, learning through our lives, we learn that certain things are rewarding, and then they become attached to that loop. So winning the lottery is an example of that. A baby would have no sense that winning the lottery was rewarding, but we learn that getting £1 million is generally most people would regard as a rewarding experience. And so the brain has, by changes in the brain, learned secondary rewards, but that's not required for primary. As you say, like sex, palatable food, maternal care, warmth, and other survival critical rewards are sort of instinctive. So we're born with them. Those will have a direct effect.
But on top of that as well, you can learn by association to associate certain environments with alcohol or, I guess, other substances as well. So can you talk about that kind of ongoing learning? So it's not just, we're not necessarily driven by taste to consume alcohol. It could be, possibly, but over time you learn these associations.
Yeah. So classic associative learning is based on experience, and it goes back to behavioral psychology that was studied over a century ago. And the basic principle is that if you do something and that is the outcome of that is good, then we're more likely to do it again. If the outcome of that is punishing, we're less likely to do it again. And through trial and error and, falling in a bed of nettles versus doing something enjoyable, we learn what is good and bad, and we avoid the bad things and are more likely to repeat the good things. And that's called associative learning. It's a reinforcing process in our behavior in the brain. And what you're pointing to there, Donal, is the addition of what's called a neutral stimulus. So in addition to that direct associative learning, we can come to associate certain familiar stimuli with receiving the reward. So a classic example, this is Pavlov's dogs. So they were trained to be given food at the sound of a bell, and then after the food was removed, just ringing the bell would cause the dog to salivate. And those are the classic experiments that underpin it. But this is a fundamental ancient biology. So even a bee sees the brightly coloured petals of a flower. It's not, the brightly coloured petals of the flower are not the reward. The reward is the pollen on the stamen of the flower, but it's directed to the flower by that. And such things override any other counter-attention. They're highly salient, as we describe in psychology. That means you can spot them over and above everything else, which of course is essential to survival. If you're in the jungle, you need to be able to spot a brightly coloured bunch of bananas before someone else eats it, and you need to be able to spot a brightly coloured snake before it bites you. And the same is true for alcohol and drugs. So the familiar smell of an alleyway may cause a relapse in a heroin addict. The view of the pub, the smells of the pub, the sounds of the pub, the smell of beer at the bar, the pouring of beer, or the first taste of that drink can all serve as reward cues for someone who is addicted to alcohol.
That's fascinating. So obviously, I'm Irish, and there's a cultural, alcohol is very much embedded culturally, but I wonder, is there genetic differences where people from the British Isles, so if you want to include Ireland and Britain in that, and as well maybe Northern Europe, is there something there? Is it an element of having harsh winters and cold weather that draws us to alcohol more than other cultures? I don't know if there's research on that. I'm not sure if you've thoughts on it. You kind of hinted it in the book, and you mentioned as well that some Asians actually can't tolerate alcohol.
Yes, there are inter-individual differences between humans in terms of their response to alcohol. So some people will be more stimulated by alcohol and have greater tolerance of it. We all know people like that. I mean, I was an example. Really, from when I first started drinking, I could drink other people under the table, and I could always get home on my own 2 feet. I very rarely had memory loss. Whereas we all know people who have a couple of drinks and then they're vomiting in the toilet or slumped in the corner. In terms of the genetics, it's complicated because whilst we know those biological differences exist and therefore they're likely to be fundamental, i.e., and we also know that they're inherited. So alcoholism, for instance, is 50% heritable. That means that somewhere in our genome, the inherited characteristics we have, 50% of the population variability is conferred by genetic differences. So we know that. The problem is that's not the same as identifying individual genes that cause a problem. And in fact, the data, to come back specifically to your question, there are no identifiable genes at the moment that are, for instance, particular to the Irish population or the UK and Ireland population or the Nordic countries versus other countries. And ancestral DNA studies show the same things that all DNA studies show, which is that there's a huge overlap with psychiatric disorders and with certain other psychological characteristics, but actually really very little variation by ancestry.
Perhaps it is just culture from a perspective from a country that actually does consume a lot of alcohol. It might be culturally embedded for some reason. Just before I do want to talk about psychiatric issues and alcohol in a second, because there's definitely a lot to say there. Before we come to that, I just want to discuss, so you mentioned studies, I think one study in taxi drivers that made them slightly improve the motor skills at moderate doses, and I have seen studies on creativity where alcohol can improve creativity at moderate doses. And sometimes I think as well that some of the issue with nicotine addiction, so smokers, is the fact that it possibly gives a cognitive boost in terms of alertness. So is there an issue there around maybe at smaller doses a bit of cognitive enhancement, or perhaps maybe just lowering anxiety levels to allow you to socialize more? And is that part of the issue, and does that contribute to addiction as well?
Well, I mean, it's all of the issue. I mean, the reason that we like alcohol is because it has psychostimulatory and relaxant effects via neurotransmitters in the brain. And alcohol's unique as a drug. I mean, it's almost unique as a chemical, but it's one of the smallest molecules we ingest as a human, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and affects, unlike any other drug, multiple neurotransmitters because of its chemical properties. And amongst those are endorphins that make you euphoric. That's replicating the effects of opioid drugs. The GABA in the reward system, which has a relaxant effect, and that overlaps the effects of ecstasy, for instance. Dopamine, overlapping the effects of cocaine and nicotine. And it also has effects on other neurotransmitters like glutamate and serotonin, overlapping other drugs. So quite unique. And that's why it's so popular. That's why it's lasted so long. I mean, we can't deny the fact that drinking alcohol for a great number of people is fun.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is, that there are people who claim alcohol's a poison and a depressant. Well, in some people it is a poison and a depressant. But for a great many people, its dominant effect is one of psychostimulation and relaxation. And that's not a deniable fact, however convenient that might be to sort of people trying to evangelize society against alcohol.
I very much like the fact you didn't take that approach in the book. You didn't evangelize or preach, because again, for very many people, it is an enjoyable thing to do, and we can't really move away from that. Could you talk a little bit about your own experience in terms of like university and work when you were, I think you were a junior doctor, and some of the experiences there? And this might amplify continuation of alcohol or maybe progression towards alcohol dependence, that it is very much, I guess, it's engrossed in university social culture and maybe even work social culture, and even at a professional level, it's not just blue collar jobs. And that might actually facilitate some of the dependence risk.
I mean, there are many motivations to consume alcohol, but peer pressure, cultural acceptability, affordability, and a number of other factors are undoubtedly important with sort of setting the starting point. So for medical school, I mean, even at my school in the upper sixth year, alcohol was ingrained as an activity. And by the time I went to university, I was already well on the way. Medical schools, of course, back in my day were riddled with alcohol-related activities in a way that they're not anymore. They've changed culturally. And in the hospital, consultants had a bar. Doctors would go at lunchtime to drink before seeing patients in the afternoon or operating. The pub over the road even had a phone extension. So if you were a junior doctor, you could answer your bleep without leaving the pub. All of that has changed now. I do think, however, there's a separation here between those sort of factors which at a societal level undoubtedly influence the number of people who drink and probably how regularly they drink and possibly what they drink versus the development of dependence. I think the development of dependence is much less motivated by that. I like to say that the influence of advertising on my drinking is, about the same as my Labradors seeing advertisements for sausages. I don't think it had very much influence on my desire to do it. But the dependence, which is not a common phenomenon, is much more to do with psychological drivers and to do with biological differences, as we've discussed.
Is it fair to say we can separate maybe the genetic architecture or the personality profile of people who become dependent and people who are maybe more grey area or regular social drinkers, or maybe a bit more than that? Like, is there a boundary there that we can firmly say, or is it more like a gradient where you can potentially move from one to the other?
It's most certainly a gradient. There are no boundaries for what's called a complex disease. So alcohol dependence and other psychological and psychiatric problems are all what are described as complex diseases. That means that in a population as a whole, they're a mix of biological, psychological, and social, or if you like, environmental influences. And in an individual, they can be any mix of those. So, there might be someone who's very strongly genetic, and there'll be a great number of other people where genetics doesn't have any role at all. I think it's fair to say that there is a gradient. The gradient of psychological disease and distress, and particularly defined psychiatric diseases, is much more associated with dependence than with grey area drinking. There is a gradient there. And the same is true of neurodiverse conditions. These are a high-risk condition for dependence.
You discussed ADHD in your book, and you discussed maybe getting a diagnosis, I think, later in life. And you said that a doctor said to you that many people who are high achievers who become dependent on alcohol might actually have an ADHD diagnosis. And this is very, very common. And it might be to do with things like I think you said a washing machine brain, maybe just overactive mind. So I'm just interested in how ADHD actually factors into this.
Yeah. So, actually, my general practitioner said she'd hardly ever seen a high-functioning alcoholic who didn't turn out to have ADHD in her experience. But there are many reasons why someone with ADHD and, to a certain extent, high-functioning autism would have a risk for substance misuse in plurality, including alcohol. And one of those things is what's called social anxiety. Not social anxiety, domestic anxiety, forgive me. So domestic anxiety is that sitting alone, you have thousands of thoughts, including negative thoughts, washing around in your brain. You're trying to silence your brain, which you can do, of course, by taking certain drugs and alcohol. And I was certainly a person like that, and with a neurotic tendency, which overlaps with ADHD. Obviously, there's a tendency to negative thoughts and negative emotions and feelings within that. And my brain literally is, even now, I get it. I'm on sertraline for depression, and that's made things somewhat better. I've been on sertraline a very long time, and I shall probably have to remain on it. Without that, my brain, things just wash around until I can find some negative thought for me to believe in, which will then preoccupy me. And if I can make that one go away, it'll go round again until it finds another one. And it's not just in me. I've met so many people with this phenomenon who just want their head to stop. And of course, you find that you can make your head stop by going around the off licence or to the pub. And not unsurprisingly, that becomes an attractive prospect, which is why there's such a strong link between these conditions and the misuse of alcohol.
I think so you mentioned something called negative urgency in the book. And again, I presume it's like a facet or maybe a subtrait of neuroticism, but it's this idea of trying to push things away really quickly. So in some ways, is that what alcohol might do, and maybe other drugs as well for different people?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, negative urgency is one of the characteristics of a neurotic personality trait. And it's the desire to make negative feelings go away as fast as possible by some form of action. And I mean, I could give you several examples of things where I do that. I mean, I'm like that at work. If I've got something to do at work, I cannot get it out of my mind. I have to do it or start it. Otherwise, it will just go round in my mind until I've done it. So and to relieve that, and negative urgency in a sense drives alcohol, because you can make things go away much quicker by taking a pill or having a drink than you can by actually working your way through them.
Let's talk about potentially maybe some of the positives of having some of these personality tendencies. So you're obviously, like, you're a bowel surgeon, you're highly successful. So could you talk about maybe how it's like almost like a double-edged sword, that some of these things might have driven you to be very successful?
But I think it comes back to the recognition that the attributes and personality traits that you were given when you were young are things that you need to get behind, not try to modify. And trust me, it's taken me a great deal of time to do that. That's not an easy or a quick thing to do. But undoubtedly, my persistence at work and my obsession with certain things and compulsion to do them has been a benefit, including writing the book, which I could easily have given up. I started writing the book to sort of answer the why me question, and then realized that any reasonable attempt at that required looking at why humans drank alcohol at all. And once you delve into that, it is a mire of social science, psychology, medicine, history, anthropology, neurobiology, etc. And there were many times writing that book where I just was going round in circles. And I guess my character traits were one of the things that I persisted with it.
Yeah, because there's more and more research now coming out in ADHD adults. Actually, there's a lot of literature on hyperfocus. And I think this might be the idea that obviously the ADHD brain, when it finds something to kind of lock into or really like focus on, it's hard to break that focus.
Yeah, that's a complete misunderstanding with ADHD. You're absolutely right that people, because it's called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, people think that people can't concentrate on things. Now, I think that is true in some school children diagnosed with it, and it is a spectrum, as we know. That's why it is a spectrum. I was much more the hyperactivity end of it, and in fact, my hyperactivity had been diagnosed since I was a 2-year-old, and I've been at the psychologist or the pediatrician since about the age of 2 or 3, and my attention deficit, as my wife would say, is much more in sort of general things. I cannot concentrate on one conversation. So, I mean, I'm okay here sitting in front of a computer because I'm very focused on you, looking at you. And in fact, actually, I find these much harder if I can't see the other person.
Wow, okay.
So I'm much worse on the telephone at maintaining attention. And so, but in a social situation, I cannot hold a conversation without thinking about something else at the same time, or hearing multiple conversations at the same time and trying to lock into the one that I'm trying to do. And my wife will talk to me and it'll be in one ear and out of the other, whilst I might be very focused on something else.
There's more research coming out as well from Neuroscience about something called the default mode network. So this is kind of like your imagination, what you do in your daydreaming, but there's a possibility, I guess, that people with ADHD, they might have an overactive default mode network. And this is maybe why stimulants work. Perhaps they might shut that off a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's probably a simplified view, Donal. The default mode network is, however, a very interesting subject. So for the context of your listeners, the default mode network is one of 7 defined what's called deep brain-wide neural networks that have only really been studied since advanced imaging made it possible, particularly a thing called resting state MRI, which allows us to look at the brain when it's at rest. So we've got forms of functional MRI been around for a long time. If I clench my fist, an area of my brain will light up corresponding to the homunculus of my wrist and my hand. But looking at what happens while we're daydreaming or thinking of ourselves or thinking of someone else or retrieving memories and things, that is much harder to study. And we're only recently getting a grip on it. And possibly the most interesting network is the DMN, the default mode network, and is responsible for a number of those activities, and particularly for something called the neurobiology of self. And this is highly relevant to self-esteem and to how we look at our position in society, compare ourselves to others, how we look at ourselves and our value. And this all appears alongside memory and certain other drivers of emotion and things to be controlled by the default mode network. And not unsurprisingly, changes in that network have been seen in neurodiverse disorders. They're also seen in addiction and a number of other related psychological traits.
From what you're saying, the DMN isn't just about daydreaming or your imagination. It might actually be central to your identity formation. Is that what I'm getting?
Yes, yeah. And I mean, I think the point I was really picking up on you on is that it's not as simple as saying things turn on and off. If only it was turning something on and off.
Giving the cartoon version of it. But
yeah. I mean, all of these networks have hundreds of different types of nerve in them. And in general, there is a balance in the brain of nerves that turn things on and turn them off. And often they're in sequence. So what turns one off to turn another on. So, it is likely that Ritalin works by having some complex relationship of nerves that turn on and off in certain parts of that network, probably that we don't fully understand, to exert its effect.
Yeah, or possibly it might tune the efficiency of the networks, perhaps, or maybe give more salience to the central executive network. I was simplifying a little
tuning
bit.
Is a good word, I think, for it. Let's rest with tuning.
No, I'm not saying it doesn't shut off a part of the brain. Sorry, I was probably being a little bit simplistic there, but no, fair point. Can I just ask about? So obviously you discussed childhood experiences, like you had a chapter about childhood experiences, and I think you discussed the role of luck, but at times it's kind of difficult to separate the role of childhood and what you experience in childhood from genes. And I think you alluded to this as well, that you said you were a sensitive child, and maybe for some people certain things wouldn't bother them as much or wouldn't stay with them as much. So is it possible to disentangle the environment from your genes and who you are? Or is it, like you obviously emphasize the biopsychosocial model, is it all just like a big network of different influences that kind of push off each other and influence each other over time?
Well, neuroticism is a good one to pick up on here, because quite recent studies have demonstrated just how genetic that is. And if you look at the genes involved in the what's called the polygenic signature, that is all the genetic variation rather than single genes that's associated with alcohol dependence, it heavily overlaps with neuroticism. And so there is a genetic element undoubtedly to that, and its connection to substance misuse and use. But then on top of that, let's take another example, I think is the best way to look at this very complicated subject. Let's take post-traumatic stress disorder. So you can take a group of a normal population of men selected to go to war. Let's take the Vietnam War, for example. Those people would have had a population incidence of alcohol dependence, that's medically diagnosed alcohol dependence like me, of about 3% in the US at the time. Their grey area drinking probably would fall in about 20% in as much as that's known. Yet 68% of Vietnam veterans have a diagnosed alcohol or drug use disorder. And so these are people that it's clearly not only genetic, or not very genetic, and the influence of significant trauma. Now, you might argue that some of that was because they started taking heroin while they were in Vietnam and there's other things to do with it. But putting that aside, very clearly there is a big mark of how the environment and what happens to us, particularly with other humans, can have a big influence on this. And the same is true of childhood neglect and abuse in particular. And it's a general heuristic that the earlier things happen to you in life, the worse the effect they are on you.
And I guess we could think about this from another perspective as well. So historically, during hardship, people have drank alcohol as perhaps a way of self-medicating or to disassociate from suffering. So in some cases, alcohol can be a way to alleviate the suffering. Is that fair to say?
Yes. And the self-medication hypothesis of alcohol brings us back to considering learning. So in learning to drink, we don't just learn what the positive things are. So I go out, I have a great time for the first time. It was really fun. Maybe you met a girl. It was a great evening. You learn that's positive reinforcement because something good happened, so we're more likely to do it again. But the same is also true of what's called negative reinforcement. So if drinking makes something bad go away, that is called negative reinforcement. And it was studied way back, B.F. Skinner, in influential psychology that's still, in rats, that's still true today. And so there's a sort of double whammy here, that if you drink for enjoyment, that's one risk, but not a terribly strong one. If you drink for enjoyment and to make yourself feel better, then that, you consider that you've got double or probably more than double the drive to repeat that behavior. And this isn't necessarily a scientific fact, but I would say it's an observation that most people would agree with. And that is that people who drink only for fun, that have no problems of self-confidence, no problems of self-esteem, no psychological issues, can go out, can just take it or leave it. Generally, it is people who are drinking to make problems go away or to make psychological traits, to change their psychological trait, or to address more significant mental health problems that are much higher risk of going on to develop problems of addiction.
This is obviously all very complex and there's layers to this. And I want you to debunk something that I actually have heard in my personal life a lot. This idea of an addictive personality. Now, obviously you cannot distill a personality down to one trait or to one type. And you mentioned something called polygenic traits or polygenic scores earlier. So there's obviously thousands of genes involved manifesting these complex traits. So we can't distill something down to an addictive personality. So if you wouldn't mind just going through that for me, please.
Yeah. So this all starts historically with the idea that, when you look around the pub and there's someone with significant alcohol problems, it's very easy to point at that person and go, why can't that person drink like a normal person, like you or me? There must be something different about them. And the Victorians, and really until the 1940s with AA, and the disease model of alcoholism, believed that that person was someone who lacked moral fortitude and willpower, that there was a recognizable personality, an addictive personality that reflected, that weak will and some, deficit in character. And of course, people have tested this hypothesis for 50 years and proved it to be incorrect. So there's no recognizable entity of personality associated with addiction. However, as we've alluded to in our conversation already, there are certain personality traits that are more often associated with problematic drinking. And those include neuroticism, but the other major one is impulsivity. And conscientiousness, for instance, and extroversion are protective to some extent against the development of alcohol-related harm.
Some people won't know what they are. Just briefly, would you explain conscientiousness and extroversion, if you would mind?
Well, conscientiousness is sort of what it is. It's really, in a way, it's a slight opposite of impulsivity, that you when you say you're going to do something, you do it, and you do it for other people, and you exhibit value that are of reliability, etc., which, someone who's impulsive might not. Extroversion is, I think extroversion is not so much the fact that it's protective, so much you're not introverted, which is more associated with neuroticism. The impulsivity is one, though, that we should talk about because that's very important. And in fact, it can be modelled in mice. So impulsive mice are more likely to be alcohol preferring and to develop addiction behaviours. And for other drugs. And you can genetically modify mice to be impulsive. And the genes for impulsivity, some genes for impulsivity have been established in humans, and they also overlap with substance misuse.
Wow. Now, I guess, not to be preachy, because I do drink alcohol as well, but can we just briefly discuss, in terms of health effects, Like, is it true to say any amount of alcohol is carcinogenic? It's a risk factor, and obviously there's a myriad of health defects that alcohol can actually lead to, and maybe they're understated, or perhaps the public aren't fully aware of them.
Yeah, I think that's true. So the World Health Organization and other medical bodies would say that there is no safe level of alcohol consumption. And I think, if you read all the evidence, that's true to a point, in that there are diseases, for instance, breast cancer in women, stroke, high blood pressure, where even a small quantity of alcohol ingestion is associated with an increased risk. But I'm of the view that there's got to be a balance in all of this. Living is dangerous. Crossing the road is dangerous. There are all sorts of things that you and I know are dangerous. And most health risks with alcohol are associated with a moderate or higher ingestion of alcohol. People drinking below the safe limits recommended by governments, which of course vary around the world and are changing in Ireland, for instance, should not be over concerned, I think. And maybe that there needs to be an aspect of personalised risk. So if a woman has a family history of breast cancer, you might think differently about your alcohol consumption than if you didn't, for instance. But I'm not here to scaremonger people on this. But I think one thing I will say that you've sort of said is that I do think as adults in a westernised society, we should be afforded the knowledge to the public of what those risks are more clearly than we are at the moment. So, for instance, smoking, we've been made aware of those, and actually alcohol's far more dangerous than smoking.
I think you alluded to this in your book, but in terms of basically all drugs, because alcohol is legal and widely available, it might actually top the chart in terms of danger to society or societal harm. Like topping illegal drugs, obviously, because they're not abundantly available, which is hard to believe.
It's absolutely true. And it doesn't just top the chart, it's so far at the top of the chart, it's in its own division. So this relates to a paper from 2007 by David Nutt and colleagues, who was the alcohol czar the drug czar, rather, to the British government at the time.
He was fired, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was fired partly because of this, because the alcohol lobbying of the government, it didn't go down very well. But you've summarised it. So whilst alcohol of itself is the fifth most dangerous drug, so it lies behind heroin, crack cocaine, street methadone and barbiturates, because of its wide consumption, so 1 in 1,000 people is a heroin addict, but 8 out of 10 adults in Britain are drinkers. So, we're talking about a huge gulf in between these things. It is by far, when you use that multiplier, the most harmful drug that we have in Western society.
Yeah, and in polite society, if you tell somebody, obviously cannabis is illegal, but if you tell somebody you're smoking cannabis, they look at you like you're an addict or there's something almost wrong with you. But I would imagine that cannabis, like from a philosophical point of view, is probably safer and less harmful than alcohol. So it's almost like alcohol grandfathered its societal acceptance.
Yeah, I think David Nutt stated that cannabis was safer than alcohol. And actually, cannabis is non-addictive. In animal studies, at least. It's not an addictive drug, whereas alcohol clearly is.
Yeah, and if you think about like the things we obviously make efforts to control, like control drugs, like any strong sedative. Alcohol can easily do what they do, and it's again widely available to any adult, which is interesting. So that just talks about, or gets at how societal norms over time shape policy. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's partly how long we've had it around. As you say, you use the term of grandfather drug. It's absolutely right. I think it's also partly that historically attempts there are notable failed attempts to control it, like prohibition in the United States, which of course, actually prohibition, to be fair, reduced alcohol-related harm very considerably. It reduced liver disease for a decade afterwards. But it did, of course, launch a generation of gangsters and criminality and various other things, and generally got the idea a bad rap. That said, there are other examples around the world. So in Sweden, the regulation of alcohol greatly reduced harm from alcohol. In Russia, where they first regulated it, reduced harm. the deregulation, the collapse of the ruble and perestroika was called the death epidemic because of the increase in adult males dying of
Deaths
alcohol-related
of despair.
disease.
They were called deaths of despair.
Yes,
You're
deaths
talking
of
about
despair.
post-Soviet Russia. Yeah.
Post-Soviet Russia. And so there is a relationship between control and the harms related to alcohol. But I think, over and above that, and don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but I think the reality is that the alcohol industry has had it very easy, and they probably had it very easy because the government, look how ingrained alcohol is in the Houses of Parliament. I think there are, 7 bars in the Houses of Parliament, and you can drink whilst on duty, giving a vote. It is totally ingrained through society.
Yeah, Boris Johnson definitely was known to exploit that, I imagine. Okay, so obviously your recovery story is amazing and it's inspirational. So let's talk about how people should approach that. You talk about the different steps and you do mention that it's going to be different for everyone. There's no one size fits all. So there's a lot here. So if you could just talk about maybe what would work for you or you found work for you and what works for others as well.
I'll start with me, although I think there are generalities across really everyone here. So for me, I just reached the bitter end of a really sad 7 years of trying to stop drinking alcohol. And I was mostly off, but occasionally on, and it was lottery as to what the outcome was. And it was a very painful period of time. And eventually, I was suicidal, had significant mental health problems, and I reached the point where I was just sick and tired of being sick and tired. And for anyone, just to dispel, any misunderstanding on this, the majority of people with alcohol dependence, this is not Leaving Las Vegas with Nicolas Cage. This is the sick and tired of being sick and tired. It's a deeply unhappy experience. And I found recovery through AA, through medical support, through the practitioner health program for doctors in the UK, and cognitive behavioural therapy and treatment of my depression, to name but a few things. And I know that people have their views on Alcoholics Anonymous. Obviously, my experience has been positive of that. AA doesn't advertise. It's attraction, not advertisement. That's one of its traditions. So I won't advertise it. It doesn't suit everyone. It is, however, the most successful approach worldwide ever and the most cost effective. And there's medical evidence and trials to prove that. But let's look what actually is in AA to help answer the question. So many people have tried to dissect out what has been this amazingly and possibly serendipitous discovery in 1939 of a way of seemingly treating, at that stage, end stage, hopeless alcoholics, as they were called, the time in a way that the medical profession had abjectly failed to deal with. And people who were going to sanitaria or the grave as a result. And really, I think there's some common themes in this, and they underpin many of the communities in grey area drinking. They underpin many of the psychological approaches that are used. And they are, first off, cognitive change. So what do I mean by that? I mean that to change our drinking, we have to change our thinking. Okay, it's just stopping drinking and bemoaning the loss and hanging on by willpower will never, ever work for anyone who has any reliance or dependence on alcohol. And I think many of your viewers and listeners will clearly recognize that. It might work for a while, but any lasting change requires a change in thinking. And that is partly an educational thing, as we're talking now, hopefully to educate, hopefully help some people, but is also a change in behavior. Because you can't think your way out of a thinking problem. And so one of the things that AA realised was that actions were really more important than words in this. That you had to change the way you lived to then help change your thinking afterwards. And that's why it's called a programme of action. And there are many aspects to that cognitive change, but let's just leave that there. The second thing is social. So it is hopeless to believe that someone like me or someone who has substantial problems with alcohol dependence is going to succeed if they're still hanging out with a bunch of diehards in their usual pub. And often people, by the end of their drinking, are isolated completely, with almost no human contact other than the man in the off license or the woman in the off license. And so there needs to be a social element here. And these community aspect of both AA and other grey area drinking communities and other self-help groups, etc., is all based on producing a new social network that is required to assist in this matter. The next thing is that with a bit of time behind us, having worked on thinking and social, you've got to start to address the psychological drivers that pushed an increased risk of drinking in the first place that we've discussed in this call. That might require professional help. It might require medical help, a psychiatrist for some. They might require tablets like I take for depression. And then finally, there is an argument, and it comes back to the default mode network and some recent neuroscience, that there is a spiritual aspect to this. And you can think of really drugs and alcohol not only as a dispiriting condition, but also something that's ingrained in the idea of a spiritual concept, that people who take drugs will talk about having a spiritual experience. We even name nightclubs after it. You know, come to London, we've got the church, the Ministry of Sound. There is an idea of a spiritual experience within this, that there is a part of our soul that is being replaced or added to by using drugs and alcohol. And what the modern studies show is that you can alter your brain by a spiritual practice, mindfulness meditation and other aspects. Selfish kindness, is another aspect of this. And that those things affect the default mode network and maybe have a role that actually Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob chanced upon for a completely different reason in 1939, but maybe proved scientifically correct.
It's very interesting you say that, because in my own personal life, I can probably think of a handful of people who maybe had issues with alcohol or other substances, and they kind of adopted religion after that. Like, you could look at it in one way in terms of like filling a social void perhaps, or is it more about meaning? Like, is there something to that? Yeah. Because I do think there's a pattern there. I'm not sure, I have never searched for data on it, I don't know, but anecdotally there seems to be something.
Yeah. Well, religion is different from spirituality. But we won't, and AA is not a religious organization, it's a spiritual organization. But of course, religion has aspects of spirituality within it. So the evidence is around the operators of spirituality that are things like mindfulness and meditation in the neuroscience literature. That's increasingly, there's numbers of papers on the subject. And there's also things like MindSight, programs of work that are looking at what really makes us human. What is the mind? And the default mode network is this neurobiology of self, of how we identify and look on ourselves, is incredibly important within that. And I suspect we'll find out a great deal more as we study it more.
Like, in terms of religious ritual, why do we talk about drinking? Like, why is wine kind of emphasized, and like different cultures around the world would emphasize different, I guess, conscious altering substances? Do you think there's a genuine connection there, or is is that stretching it a bit?
I think it comes back to certainly to the filling a void aspect. Well, the idea of there being a spiritual context to drinking alcohol. And the Romans were big on alcohol. Obviously, the Christian religion has the blood of Christ, and many other religions, Taoism, Judaism. Alcohol is part of rituals. You're absolutely right. I think I honestly don't know the answer to that question. There might be different for different people.
Yeah,
I was certainly a person who, if the communion wine was left on the side, I'd drink everything that remained and then find the bottle back in the vestry. So, that maybe wasn't intended. But
yeah, so you spoke about addressing psychological issues to actually, I guess, remove them or kind of temper them before you can deal with the alcohol part. But I think you kind of insinuate in your book that sometimes people avoid talking about the alcohol part with a therapist or a cognitive behavioral therapist or whatever type of therapy they're using. The alcohol becomes like the elephant in the room, and maybe the therapist doesn't want to address it and the individual doesn't as well. But obviously it's important to get to that as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I think to engage in therapy. And what I say in the book is I don't think any of this can be done with a drink still in hand. And this is one of the huge advantages of things like Dry January, because a large number of people have been able to look at their relationship with alcohol by having a month off. And I mean, partly it's just a simple clarity of thought problem, that if you're still drinking, trying to address deeply held psychological issues or anything else or change your thinking, just simply not going to be possible. And it's not possible for you, and it's not possible for your psychotherapist either. I mean, I don't want to be unfair on psychotherapists, but I think, I have had experience of them. And there are some that say, well, I just don't talk about drugs and alcohol. I'm here to deal with, psychoanalysis and other things. And of course, there'll be many clients that don't really want to talk about it either. You could be cynical about this, that a psychotherapist wants to maintain the relationship with their client. And so both people avoid discussing the issue. But I think very often, it will be the issue. And my diagnosis of depression came at the same time as my first diagnosis of alcoholism, which is nearly 20 years ago. I mean, it almost certainly preceded it. But you can't have one without the other. My psychiatrist was very clear. He said, I think you do have depression, but your main problem is alcoholism. But I mean, I was lucky because, there are many psychiatrists, that would be considered quite a radical approach to, being honest with people.
So just speaking about psychiatrists there, sometimes people in the lay public have an issue with the idea of the medical model, but I think maybe they interpret it incorrectly or they don't think through it. But if we talk about drug treatments, and I think there's potential for things like GLP-1s or Ozempic to play a role here, it seems to treat a variety of conditions, not just diabetes or not just obesity. So could we just break down what's available in terms of drug treatments? I think there's probably older ones that maybe just give you a bad reaction to alcohol, but GLP-1, Ozempic might be more about controlling cravings, or it might stop that high-level reward for hedonistic substances or experiences.
Yeah, the GLP-1s are highly topical because of their hugely widespread use. But before we get to those, which are a relatively new thing, drugs are used, medical drugs are used in the context of alcohol in two ways. One for withdrawal, where we've had, heminevrin, chlorohydrate, and now Librium. Very, very dangerous drugs when used while still drinking. Killed Hank Williams, killed Keith Moon, killed Amy Winehouse, to give you some examples. And then there were two types of drug that are broadly used specifically for harmful and dependent drinking. The first of those you alluded to is Antabuse, which is a drug that makes you vomit. It basically gives you alcohol flushing syndrome when you drink, which is a deeply unpleasant experience. And the idea is that aversive response deters you from drinking. The problem is that you'd have to force people to take them, and they just simply stop taking them. And so they've really not got a terribly good record in any long-term treatment. So we've then got drugs that modify the stimulant and relaxant effect you get from alcohol to make it less attractive to drink because you just get less buzz out of it. And there are a variety of drugs, licensed and unlicensed, that are used for that. I'm not going to run through all of them. Most of them are expensive, and some of them have pretty bad side effect profiles. And there's quite a lot of misuse of things like gabapentin and things, for instance, that are drugs of misuse now as well as drugs of use. And they vary in licensing country to country. Methyl naltrexone is probably the commonest generally licensed drug, but it's an expensive drug and not completely safe. The problem with all of these, though, is a bit like, as I say in the book, like a gym membership. These are long-term problems. As we've already said, the real long-term treatment to become sober rather than just not drinking requires a change in thinking, social, other aspects. And that's not going to happen with 6 weeks treatment of a tablet any more than remaining fit is going to happen with a New Year's gym resolution and not going to the gym afterwards. But let's get back to GLPs. So GLPs may change the face of this. Let's be clear first to the audience. GLPs are not licensed for use in addiction. This is an incidental effect that I first heard about actually from venture capitalists who had discovered this and were looking to, invest even more in GLPs than are already investing in it, which is a huge amount. And it'd been noticed anecdotally, but proven in experimental studies in man and in laboratory animals, that actually these GLP inhibitors have an effect on dopamine in the brain and on pathways by which alcohol mediates its euphoric effects. So they're a bit like the drugs I talked about, like methyl naltrexone, that damp the things. And I have met people who have stopped taking them because they don't have as much fun going out drinking.
Wow. Okay.
And so, but the literature shows that they reduce drunkenness or opioid overdose, harms from alcohol, and general alcohol weekly consumption in people with alcohol use disorder and similarly in opioid use disorder.
Like apparently people who've taken it for diabetes or obesity, they talk about biting their nails less and just noticing that they're less habit driven. Obviously those things aren't necessarily reward driven. They might just be learning mechanisms or habit mechanisms. So perhaps there's something, like you said, there's something to do with learning going on there that we don't fully understand in terms of GLP-1s.
Yeah, well, the thing with GLP-1s is that these are based in, their effects are based across a whole range of metabolic pathways in the brain, outside of the brain. The pancreas and the stomach were their main roles for obesity and the regulation of insulin. But, these are widespread effects. I think we don't know. And they're probably not the same effects in everyone.
Professor David Nutt has talked about, I think he might have actually developed this, an idea of like a non-toxic pharmacological agent that maybe allows a little bit of drunkenness, but it has like a ceiling effect. And I'm not sure if it has the same level of addictiveness. So this is kind of a different idea to the lower alcohol options. It's more like something that tastes like alcohol, but it doesn't have the same effect. Have you heard of ideas like that? And do you think they're actually promising? But probably not, because the lobby of the alcohol industry, I'd imagine, maybe they wouldn't actually get to.
I have heard them. I've tried them. Look, all I will say is this, that if something had a genuine effect on neurotransmitters in the brain to cause a psychological, a psychoactive effect, it would have to be medically regulated now.
Okay.
No one would be able to sell a new thing if it was proven to have a psychoactive effect. So, that makes me slightly skeptical. But people should try it and see.
But am I correct in saying they're out there?
They are, yeah.
Okay.
There are some drinks that I think they purport to cause relaxation through a GABA mechanism.
Okay. Am I correct in saying you actually studied the bowel from a neuroscientific perspective? I'm curious, like, what type of studies do you do with this? And in terms of like the gut-brain axis and all that, can we understand things like irritable bowel through personalized medicine?
I study conditions of the gut. As a surgeon, I'm more in the sort of chronic constipation and incontinence side of things than the irritable bowel side, but I have published papers on irritable bowel. But we're back to the complex disease, biopsychosocial.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about it.
And it is a classic complex disease, irritable bowel syndrome. And there are people in which that is almost certainly more what I call peripherally driven. That is that there are problems of motility and sensation in the gut. And there are people where it's more centrally driven from the brain and relates to stress and a number of other things akin to what we've talked about.
Do you think that there's no structural, do you actually think there isn't a structural difference? Because some people, it seems so severe, there must be a structural difference.
Well, there's no visible structural difference. Microscopically, opinions vary on the subject, and there are studies, particularly of diarrhea-predominant irritable bowel syndrome, that show that there's a low-grade inflammatory response associated with that. And, we could get into the arguments about counting numbers of inflammatory cells in different parts of the gut wall and whether those mediate excitation of sensory nerve endings and things.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure. And the book is fantastic. I really enjoyed it because a lot of the popular books on alcohol aren't very good, but this was excellent. I will be recommending it. Pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan, for having me on the show, and thank you for your words about the book.